Do you think there's something that players might miss when they're playing the game?
Fun fact is, the size of monuments is usually quite right for the lighthouse, the pyramids, the Sphinx, but temples are usually about three times the size higher than reality, because the game uses this third perspective camera with the lens, and it usually what it does is it puts landmarks smaller than they really are if we have them on the right scale.
Previously on the podcast, we dug deep into the sands of Egypt to uncover the history behind Assassin's Creed Origins. The game gives players the chance to experience meeting Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, the wars with her brother Ptolemy, in a more immersive way than any previous retelling of the story could. And of course, it lets you do what no tour group can today: clamber all over and inside ancient monuments of Egypt and get your claws into the real Sphinx. Today, I'm joined again by historian and video game writer Holly Nielsen. Hi, Holly.
Hi, Matt. Together, we'll step into the Animus to uncover how history and gaming interact with Assassin's Creed Origins. And later in the episode, I'll speak to Maxime Durand, who is the world design director at Ubisoft, another spectacular title, about how the developers met the challenge of recreating the people and places of the past. So, Matt, you learnt about ancient Egypt, and I'm wondering, what did you think of Assassin's Creed Origins?
One of the joys of doing this for me is that I'm learning stuff other than medieval history, so it's been fantastic to spend time in different places and different periods, and ancient Egypt was definitely something I don't know much about, so I was really interested to learn more of the history behind some of the key events in the game. I probably have to say that Origins is not a game I've played all that much. Played it a little bit a while ago, came back to it maybe a few months ago, but didn't play very much. I think Origins probably fell in my too busy being a parent kind of non-gaming era of my life. So I'd have to also concede it's not a game I know all that well.
I think that's a good excuse for not having played a game. I remember when it came out, I went to Gamescom, which is a big kind of games event in Cologne in Germany, and I was there covering it for The Guardian, and one of the main things we were covering was Assassin's Creed Origins coming out, so I previewed the game there, and I remember it was very exciting because this was the kind of soft relaunch of the series, and they were really putting an emphasis on their connections with their academics and the amount of research being put in. And so I was sent there as kind of the token historian, games journalist, to ask some questions, and left feeling very excited. But I didn't actually play the full game, until for this podcast. So it was a brilliant excuse to go back and actually see kind of beyond the preview. And yeah, very impressive. I could see where all that, expertise went.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that Chris Naunton, so when we had our episode with Chris Naunton about the Sphinx, during lockdown, he did a load of stuff with Origins around, particularly discovery mode, going exploring lots of the places as a way to kind of teach ancient Egypt during lockdown. And he couldn't talk highly enough about how much work and effort had clearly gone into recreating the atmosphere, Alexandria in particular, the detail that's gone into recreating a city like that, and the way that the pyramids and the Sphinx and things like that looked. He was full of praise for it. So I think if extra effort had gone in, it definitely didn't go unnoticed.
Yeah, and I think the Discovery Tour is just such an interesting thing. I think, I'm going to talk to Maxime about it because he was, the kind of director on Discovery Tour. It's really interesting because before this, obviously, they create these really lavishly created, historical game worlds. But when it comes to using it in an educational sense, you have these, people in museums and teachers saying, oh, these are wonderful. I can't use them because of, the violence and the combat and all of this. So Discovery Tour is a way for educators and, for players of the game who want to learn more to really get in the world. And I remember because I was teaching history in video games at the time to undergraduate students, and it was just before Discovery Tour came out. And I remember Ubisoft were very lovely, and they couriered a PlayStation over to the university for a seminar so I could play, and then they couriered it back, and that was really wonderful of them. But obviously that's not a sustainable way of teaching a game. And and obviously the game is still primarily, it's an entertainment product. It is what it is. You're never going to be able to make it totally accessible on that level. But Discovery Tour does help a lot. And I think particularly museums are finding it incredibly helpful because it costs a lot of money to create kind of really detailed digital worlds. And so why not use this? And I think also it really helps because, at least from my perspective, it seems like this is a real turning point in terms of Ubisoft's interaction with academic institutions, and it becomes a much more kind of back and forth thing in their working, creating these longer connections. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear what Maxime has to say about all of that as a key part of it, because it's I guess it's interesting what Ubisoft are getting out of doing that, because they're making a game, they want people to buy a game, and if you strip all of the gameplay out of it, they've invested a lot of the money that universities and museums can't afford to pay to create these things. Ubisoft have spent that money to almost give it away. And I guess maybe there's something reciprocal in the help that they're getting from academics and things like that it's good for that relationship. But it'd be interesting to see, how it came about and why Ubisoft were keen to do it.
It's really fascinating. And also I'm really interested to hear about kind of when in development it came up. And was it something that they knew straight away they were going to do? Or was it something kind of later on in development they were like, oh, we should maybe look at doing something with this? I'm really curious to hear about that because, I have no idea. So very interested to hear about that.
And I wonder as well how much work it is. Do you just flip a switch and turn off all the combat and the violence and or does it actually, do you have to rebuild parts of the game to allow it to happen? I'm not sure I know the physics and the logistics of all of that.
I could just hear game developers just like, no, Matt, no. But it is interesting as well because the tours are written by experts and by Egyptologists, historians, archaeologists. This game always stands out to me is that, every single game has a huge amount of work that goes into it. Every single game has, countless hours of labor behind it. But this one in particular, in terms of the detail, there's so much detail, both kind of the stuff that goes into Discovery Tour and also I remember when I was doing that preview and I interviewed Maxime all those years ago. And one of the things he was bringing up was the language that's being spoken by background characters, because you have Greek and Latin being spoken. Then you also have, and I'm afraid I cannot remember the proper term for it, but ancient Egyptian, essentially. I'm sure Maxime will correct me. Because, we don't know what that sounded like. And so they put in all this effort into recreating it. I'm sure Maxime will tell us about that. And I just remember thinking, God, that is a lot of work. That is a huge amount of work for something that is literally in the background. The main characters don't speak. They speak, there's kind of words and terms peppered in, but it's largely, English or whatever language that the player is selected playing in. And yet that's a huge amount of work for something that's in the background. And I am so fascinated to hear about that.
Yeah, it's kind of how do you rationalize the business investment in creating and developing all of that thing that is verbal in the background that probably most players aren't paying too much attention to, but it's all about creating the atmosphere, I guess, which is obviously something that Ubisoft at this point began to feel was really important to flesh the game out.
Yeah, it's kind of really pushing into that idea of authenticity and immersing the player in this world, not just aesthetically, but kind of culturally and socially as best we can within kind of their interpretation of it. So it is really fascinating kind of hearing about, I don't want to say the justification, because we see the justification in the game itself, but about those conversations about, hey, I'm thinking of spending, how many X amount of hours on this language. And yeah, I'm really interested. 'Cause I remember hearing about it at the time and being like, God, that's ambitious.
Yeah. And when we did the history episodes around all of this, the setting for it kind of really leapt out as, you've got Caesar and Cleopatra and Ptolemy the 13th and all of those kinds of people. You've got these huge names, and you've got the siege of Alexandria, the Alexandrian War, this really contained place. But it also seemed like there was a big opportunity for lots of the more cultural stuff around it, which fits with the language, I guess, because you're talking about the time when the Library of Alexandria is burnt to the ground. Culture that had been built up is being lost, almost overnight in this outbreak of violence in this cultural hub of a city. So there is, it feels like a really good setting for a game in that there is violence, there are famous people, there are huge seismic events, but there are also these little cultural nuances going on all around it that lend itself to building that really big atmosphere.
And it's such an interesting setting because, like you, this is not my area of expertise at all. I mainly look at Victorians and early 20th century British history. So I was learning, actually through Discovery Tour, I learned a lot. I kind of started Discovery Tour and I was like, oh, I should really take, I should take a look at this. And then I ended up spending hours just going round and round, just having a really great time. And it's a really interesting setting because it is so turbulent culturally and socially. You have, all these different influences and these and I think the kind of Ptolemy, Cleopatra kind of tension is a really interesting way of exploring this kind of idea of kind of old Egypt and these newer kind of colonists essentially, and then the kind of Greek. It's really, really interesting. And I remember going in and being like, oh yeah, ancient Egypt, I know there's pyramids, there's this, and, kind of going in and being like, oh, okay, right, this is really fascinating. And also something that we know a surprising amount about daily life because of what's been left behind, which is really, really interesting. And it's also, I really love it. I'm gonna be a writer narrative nerd for a little, a small portion here if you'll allow it. But I was playing the game and you have got these big backdrops of these really big characters, these big events. I wasn't expecting to be drawn in as much as I was with the narrative of the game and with the characters of Bayek and Aya, his wife, and their relationship. I really love because you don't often see in games or in media in general kind of a loving established relationship. There's often a lot of focus on like the new and exciting, but here's this couple that really love each other and are going through something and struggling with it, but still support one another. And I really love that. And so I really love that the narrative intimacy that goes alongside these really big macro events. And I think this game does that really well. It doesn't over-explain itself at the beginning, which I really love from a narrative perspective. When you go in, you're kind of, guided to do this stuff and you're kind of like, wait, what's going on? And you gradually learn. The game doesn't just, throw it all at you in the beginning. It's a much more kind of natural narrative process. And I really love it for that. It was one thing I was going in kind of almost expecting to be wowed by the setting, but I was equally as drawn in with the way that they work the narrative with the historical background. I thought it was really great and humanizing, and yeah.
And I guess there would have been a risk of investing so much in the way that it looked and the cultural aspects that we've talked about with the language and things like that you could almost sort of blown the narrative and just thought, just have a wander around this place and occasionally you'll get into a fight. But it's nice if they've invested as much in the narrative and as much in the characters and the story as they have in the history and presenting the places for the players.
Yeah, because it's a difficult balance because you're not only spending, tens, if not potentially hundreds, if you're my dad, loves Assassin's Creed and has 100%ed this game. He's done literally everything in this game. And if you have played this game or even glanced at it, that's a real, that's a dedication. So you're not just spending a lot of time within the world itself, but you're spending a lot of time with these characters. You're spending a lot of time with the protagonist. And so you've got to enjoy or at least find them compelling. And I think they really do. I remember hearing at the time when reviews were coming out, people praising it for that and being like, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, I was still surprised at how swept up I got in the human drama of it all. And I think it's really nice having that, particularly in historical games, because sometimes the emotional history can be lost. The idea that, in amongst these huge, big macro events and these huge, great set pieces and big characters, there's people living their lives and struggling with things and being emotional and being human. And so I think it balances that really well.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well. You mentioned earlier that we know quite a lot about daily life in ancient Egypt. And then you can throw in a character like Ptolemy the 13th, who is a significant player during the events that the game covers, but someone that we actually know very, very little about. So the game makers then, I guess, have lots of leeway for what to do with Ptolemy. Is he going to be a snot-nosed little oik? Is he going to be someone who is incredibly clever, but in the shadow of Caesar and Cleopatra? And I guess it gives them the space to play with the character in a way that you can't criticize, because you can't say that's not true, because we simply don't know what Ptolemy the 13th was really like. So it seems like they've stuck to lots of the everyday cultural stuff that we have, but also been able to play with someone like Ptolemy and make him whatever they want to be. And again, we talked to Chris Naunton about the Sphinx, and he said there's lots we don't know about the Sphinx. So you can kind of play with all of the conspiracy theories around what the Sphinx was and what it was for and what it did and how old it is and what might be inside it or not inside it. And so the game is able to engage with lots of those things that we don't know. And essentially Assassin's Creed is a big conspiracy theory. So why not lean into some conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I remember going in always being slightly, I don't know if worried is the right word, but kind of with the kind of like, oh no, are they going to go down the kind of like ancient alien kind of pseudo archaeology kind of route that can be kind of harmful in kind of wider discourse. But I think they actually do it pretty well and I think also Discovery Tour really helps that, because Discovery Tour doesn't just go into the history of the setting, it also goes into the decisions they made in making the game. So they say, okay, here are theories around the Sphinx. We depicted it this way because of, X, Y, Z, or, we used this theory when building in, I think, Khufu's pyramid. They name the specific theory that they followed. And I think that's really interesting, because I think the demystifying of the development process is really important. And it also means that they then do get to play with these things of being like, look, we know, kind of saying, look, guys, we know that this isn't how it is, but we get to play with that. And I think also the game itself, it has an air of mystery, because this is, very late in terms of, these monuments would be hundreds, if not thousands of years old to the people within the game. And so they're playing with that mystery for the characters as well as for us. And so it is a really great setting for that. I think they do it very well.
It definitely feels like a really good decision as a place to do the soft reboot, the soft relaunch, to put in all of that extra work that they wanted to put in. It seems like ancient Egypt was maybe the right place to do all of that.
Yeah, I think it's great setting because it feels intimate in some ways and yet interesting, a lot of leeway, but then also lots of rich detail they can pull on. I think a really great setting for that.
Yeah, I mean, talking of intimate, we spent a lot of time with Chris Naunton talking about the Sphinx's backside. Which probably felt unnecessary, but
someone's got to talk about it, and if not us, then who?
yeah. But it was just interesting that those kind of things are the things that the game can engage with, while saying, as you said, look, okay, it's not 100% the history, but this is why we've gone with this. This is why we made those decisions, and I think those can be really interesting. Aside from playing the game, it can be interesting to understand how they've interpreted the history and how they've arrived at the decisions that they've presented to the game players.
Yeah, exactly. Because this is they're creating, there's all these different axes of why, you've got level designers saying, okay, well, we need things to be a certain size because the character moves, this amount, and we need them to be able to jump from there to there. And then you've got artists saying, okay, well, we need to have this, and this because we have these assets, and, we can't use enough memory to be able to create this. And then you've got narrative people go, so you've got all these different elements, and especially in a huge game like this and in a huge development team. And so there are compromises and there are decisions being made, and being able to actually talk about that, I think, is really important. And I was really, really happy when I played Discovery Tour and they had these, explicitly saying, hey, this is why us as the team made these decisions. And I think that's really, really great. I think we need a bit more of that in game development, because game development can be very hidden behind closed doors. It can be very difficult to actually know what the process is, because it's kind of not a secret, but in some ways it's kind of guarded in a way, or there is a kind of mystery. If we're talking about kind of, mystifying things, game development can sometimes see, okay, there's a bunch of game developers in a room and then, they work on it for 3 years and then out comes a game, and the actual process behind it is lost, or it's not spoken about, or it's not, there's a lot of misconceptions or just falsehoods around what actually goes into developing a game. So actually demystifying the development process alongside, this historical aspect, I think is a really great and clever choice, and made me very happy to see it, because, oh boy, just as I'm sure there are a lot of, a lot of falsehoods said about ancient Egypt, the same can be said for game development. A lot of stuff flying around where you're like, wait, hang on. Although we haven't quite got to ancient aliens yet in terms of making games, but I'm sure we'll get there at some point.
It's got to be in the pipeline. I'm really looking forward to your chat with Maxime now, and I'm really interested to find out how Discovery Mode came about and why the decisions were made around all of that. So it should be a really interesting chat. I'm kind of jealous that you get to do it and I don't.
Oh, thanks, Matt. And we are joined by Maxime Durand, who is World Design Director at Ubisoft. Thank you so much for joining us, Maxime.
Good day, Holly. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I just wanted to start by asking a bit about you and your career, because, well, I think when I first met you, you were are you the kind of historian at Assassin's Creed? Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, totally. So I joined Ubisoft back in 2010. And I did study history. I had worked in museums as a guide, and I was really inspired to work in making history alive. But it was really by a stroke of luck that I got into Ubisoft, because back in 2010, they were looking to hire their first in-house historian, someone that could help them to create these games full-time and really to help them get to that level of authenticity that they were looking for. So now it's been over 14 years, and but my passion for making history accessible through video games has endured through time, and it has been a very, very interesting ride.
And now you are World Design Director, which is a very impressive title. So can you say a little bit what that involves?
Yes. So realistically, my journey as a historian has evolved through time, and I got into more responsibilities, into planning on the long term with projects, with partnerships, and ultimately projects that I worked on that were the Discovery Tours. They had to find a title that would suit me well, and that was the one that made the most sense, in the way that a world design director at Ubisoft usually is someone who's responsible to make the immersion in games like Assassin's Creed. So I think that really fits well into what I've been doing, into trying to make sense and trying to get people inspired by buildings, crowd life, and all different elements that make the past alive.
What a good job you've done. That's why we're here talking about it. Cool. And so, to move on to Origins, because this week Origins is the game that we're tackling. And so Origins was kind of seen at the time as kind of a soft reboot for the series. And it kind of seemed to bring, at least this was my impression, it seemed to bring a kind of even deeper connection and dialogue with experts and academic institutions. Previous games had always had, historians and academic experts, but I don't know, Origins seemed to really up it a level in terms of interaction. What prompted this kind of slight change?
So I think there were external reasons and internal reasons. I'd say the external reason is that we'd created these games ever since Assassin's Creed 1, which I wasn't part of, but still there was this, this success story that wasn't planned. The company couldn't have told that it was going to be so successful. There was external motivations, because there were teachers, museums, and researchers that were starting to pick up on this and thinking that it could be very interesting. And as for ourselves, with games like Assassin's Creed 3, we were already looking for partnerships, but ultimately we were already always doing these partnerships too late in the process, and that was something we wanted to change with Assassin's Creed Origins, and we had the time to do it. So the team that made this game, the creative team, really started back in the late 2013, early 2014. So that gave us enough time to actually create this discussion with museums beforehand and see how we could work together. And for us, the big benefit to that was that working with them early had a better opportunity to have a good consequences on the game, good creative opportunities, better immersion for players. And this is what it's all about for us, ultimately, to make the best game. And part of making it more immersive through collaboration was something that was really important for us.
So for Origins, you worked with a really huge, impressive roster of academics and institutions. I think one of them is Jean-Claude Gauvin. So if you play an Origins Discovery tool, you'll see his amazing watercolor pictures. And so was Gauvin someone you knew from the very beginning you wanted to work with? Or was he did you discover him as you were researching?
We discovered him as we were researching. There was this dual opportunity where he is just such an important player in reconstitutions. I mean, it's almost been a decade, but he had a career that's 50 years long with reconstitution, with preservation, and he had something that was very unique, which is to represent the past in a very colorful and lively way, but that's still respectful of science. That is a take that is acceptable. And so we realized that working with him would help us to be much more efficient. Because there's a lot of content that he had already published that was there and that we could access without asking him. But then there were all of these situations, these small villages, these landmarks that have never been represented in visual ways, in accessible ways. And working with him just truly changed the way that we're actually doing our research. It was much faster, because he could send us ideas, show us the first draft, and then he would paint it. So that really made a huge difference in the process, and ultimately it made the quality much better. And so that's an example with Jean-Claude Gauvin, but the same example goes along with all of the different collaborators that we had on this project, whether it's language, whether it's tapestries, graffiti on the wall. These are all elements that working with specialists go much faster, because publications are always much slower to get to us because they take time to be published and reviewed and so on. So that was really a great experience.
That's really true. That's something I've come across being in both the academic history world and the game development world, is the timescales are very, very different. It takes so long for academic research to come out, and a video game, in contrast, is a pretty quick turnaround, even a big video game.
Exactly. So, a game like Assassin's Creed is usually between 2 and 4 years of development. It can be a little bit more, a little bit less. But when we talk academics, it's, as you say, it's a much different scale. So really having these insights, asking for these specialists also to commit to some ideas was something that's interesting. And the way that we collaborate with them is that we really try to be honest about the kind of work that we do and how it's going to be perceived and what are the opportunities and risks. I think more and more academics today want to be involved in such projects, but some others are not interested, and they're not interested in video games at all, and I respect that also. Although they pass on an opportunity to bring their research to millions of people, and that's really, I think, the added value for both parties in this case.
I guess that's why Gauvin in particular was particularly great. And you're discussing here, a lot of academics can sometimes be a bit hesitant to put a pin in a theory, particularly going back to ancient Egypt. A lot of the time, all we have are theories. And, obviously some of these theories have, the science to back them up. But when you're creating a game world, when you're creating a narrative, you have to you have to put a pin in it. You have to say, okay, this is how we're going to represent that. How did those dialogues go sometimes with experts?
As I said, we were very honest with them in the way that sometimes they could, especially with Gauvin, he brought us information about regions, landmarks, the way people were living in the past, and it was very clear from the beginning that not everything would make the cut into the game. And one good example of that is the Talamegos. So it's this huge moving palace that was built on a ship for the Ptolemaic dynasty. And we really wanted to have this in the game. And so we asked Jean-Claude Galvin to make, plans, very specific plans and detailed plans about the ship itself, and, based on mostly unwritten accounts. And then he brings his experience of knowing about architecture of the same era. So he can really make something that might be believable. Maybe we're far away. We'll never know. But ultimately, that brought us inspiration, and we looked on the technical side if that was something we could do, if it had, added narrative inputs and value to the game. But in this situation, well, it didn't make the cut. But still, that's part of the process. We do a lot of research. We work with these collaborators. We try to get as much as we can at the beginning of the process to absorb as much information as possible. And then we make decisions. We make decisions mostly based on what will make the best player's experience in the end, what will make regions like Egypt feeling immersive and authentic, although it's not a reconstitution. It has to feel like one, but it's not one. And then we have to balance also the fact that because it's a game, it's made by humans, we just have, enough amount of time and resources and budget to actually do everything. We cannot reproduce everything, even if we know it. We have to make choices like houses and landmarks. They are kits usually that we reuse throughout the game. And that really helps us to make these huge world. But if we were actually just trying to do a reconstitution, we would probably end up with something much smaller because we couldn't actually create these massive worlds. But I think the trade-off here is that whenever we have historical information or debates or archaeological debates, we would really try to get as much information as possible. We try to balance the advantages and the risks of making decisions. And we really think about the player experience and what will make the best game out there and make the players happy about what they've played.
I mean, I would have loved to have seen a giant floating palace. That sounds great. But I can hear the kind of sighs from programmers and level designers at the thought of a giant moving palace. That makes a lot of sense. And of course, in Origins, there is just so much detail. And I think it is in the small details that the kind of socio-cultural history of a setting really comes to life, even outside of the big characters, the big buildings. It's these kind of small everyday details. And the one that really stands out in Origins is the language. Because the background characters and crowd characters, there's a bit of Greek, there's a bit of Latin, but then there's also this kind of ancient Egyptian. And from my expertise is in the Victorian era, so this is from learning through Discovery Tour and reading, but we don't really know what ancient Egyptian sounded like. So how did you go about recreating this?
Here with this one, I think there are many answers to this. And I'll start with the basic one. So we try to recreate a language that doesn't exist anymore. We can say it's called Kemetic or ancient Kemetic language, because Kemet or Chemet is the old word from the Egyptians themselves to depict their own country. And so the idea was to work with Egyptologists, Perrine Poiron, Evelyne Ferron also. And what we came upon was to try to recreate sounds from the past that would be authentic in some ways. So we know about the words. We know from Gardner's work about Egyptian words. We don't know about the vowels so much. So this is based upon interpretation and what is the most likely in terms of formulation. Like Kemet, for instance, is one that we don't know about the vowels precisely, but it would make sense in the way that it's pronounced. And then the idea is that it's very specific on Assassin's Creed. We have had this voice designer for ever, as long as Assassin's Creed has existed, Nicholas Grimwood. And Nicholas, so because he's worked on most of the games of the franchise, he has so much experience and knowledge in how to make these sounds for the crowd life. And he's interested in going very deep to get, the good stuff out there, the most immersive stuff. And so what he did is basically use these Egyptian words. He made sentences out of these words. The sentences themselves don't make any sense. It's like words are inverted. He doesn't respect the grammar. But what he was looking for was to create this emotion out of the Egyptian words. So they used actors and actresses across the region surrounding Egypt with Arabic descent, with Egyptian and Israeli descent, so that they could bring this diversity that would well represent the diversity that was in Egypt before. And so they tried these words, when we hear them, they feel like it's Egyptian because they are. The sentences themselves, nobody can understand the grammar because it makes no sense. But the actors are playing every sentence in context. So if there's a fisherman talking to someone else and explaining something, like a story about how their day went, we feel this because the actor played it with intention. And so I think that's really something that brought a lot of authenticity into the game. Did the team have to go this deep? I don't know. But ultimately, I think it's harder to create from nothing than it is to create from inspiration. Everyone that is creative, I think, draws their inspiration from somewhere, whether it's conscious or unconscious. In this case, it was a conscious decision, but it created something that was unique, but that felt authentic. And I think it brought a lot of value. And we could go on with that, even with the Egyptian words that were brought into the main language, like Bayek uses these insults or these words that come and go, and they come from the same source ultimately. They come from historical sources, and from the language. Their pronunciation might be off again because of the vowels, but their meaning is the same. So maybe I shouldn't talk about Naked Hiadit, but that's an insult that Bayek repeats often in the game, and
it's a favorite.
I think it's a favorite, and I very well remember when we found that out with the narrative director, with Alain Mercier back in the day, and even today he still says it to me sometimes. But it feels like even if it's not something that players know of before they play the game, it kind of goes after that as something they know very well, and it's associated with the game. It has this feeling of authenticity, even though it was meaningless to them before.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned authenticity, and I think it would be great to discuss. I think there might be some people listening who would like to know the difference between accuracy and authenticity, because that's been coming up a lot in our discussions. And obviously, because as you say, I mean, I'm a big believer in, well, what is accuracy? Accurate to which histories and all of that. So what do you mean when you say kind of authentic?
I realize that even myself, within the career I've had at Ubisoft, I've changed the way I use the term authenticity versus accuracy. I remember at the very beginning of my career, people would ask me, how accurate is the game? Like, it's very difficult to tell because we don't know what we don't know, and we make choices. Whereas with authenticity, we're not asking if it's true. We're asking if it feels true or if it feels believable, I think. And I think this is what we're trying to convey. So let me get an example from Assassin's Creed Origins, because we're in Egypt. We looked at the daily life of the past. There are many books about this, and there are great publications, and we're very lucky because the tombs, the Shaptis, these are like the small genies that are in tombs, the written accounts. We have a lot of information about the daily life in Egypt, especially because it has endured for so long, like how the people went fishing, how they hunted hippos, for instance, to get the meat, and how they harvested ingredients to make papyrus based from the plant. And so all of these elements we're aware of, but in the game, how it translates into authenticity instead of accuracy is that we'll find hippos in one specific place as a landmark in the game, instead of having hippos everywhere, so that it helps players to understand where they are at in the game. Because if we went back to Egypt, most villages would probably have a lot in common. They would probably all harvest papyrus, and probably a lot of them would hunt ducks and so on to get their food. But in the video game, we need to make distinctions. So some things are similar, like architecture, but then there are very distinctive activities in the game that are fictive, and they're a lie, because it helps players to situate themselves in the game. But it feels authentic, but it's not accurate.
No, that's a really fantastic example, and thank you so much for that description. I think it's really, really helpful. You get asked that question a lot. I remember whenever a historical game comes out, I always get editors or something asking me, going, you go along and ask how accurate is this game, and I'm going like, oh no, that's the most boring thing we can do with history.
It puts it in a very dualistic answer. Also, it's like it is or it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Whereas any form of representation of the past, whether it's scientific or if it's entertainment, has more or less accuracy, like authenticity.
And I think kind of any kind of expert engaging with something will tell you that. Will kind of say, we have theories, we have certain, but you get beyond a certain point when you look at something and you realize just how complicated it is. And often those complications don't really fit well into the medium of a video game, particularly one that's a kind of big 3D world where people have to locate themselves and know what they're doing and understand why they're there and things like that. So going back to, you did bring it up, the language. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of, why spend so long on the language like that? Why put so much time into that?
I think it's really a matter of making the best quality out there. The people that work on these games. I mean, a lot of developers that I know that I've worked with over the last decade, they're quite passionate about being able to translate everything that they're researching and make it into the game. It's always, again, it's complex, but that's really something that I feel that is unique. It's unique. This is what players are expecting more and more. But also, even if they're aware that it's not, a reconstitution, it's a work of fiction. But from the employee side, from the creator side, I think there's this real interest in trying to find ways to make the best game out there, the most distinct one. And that passes through immersion. It's an opportunity that we have. Sometimes we're closer, we're more authentic. Sometimes we're less. And that's in the same game. It can be in between different games also. But there's really, I think, a lot of passion from the development team about being able to translate the past into something that will be unique and very creative. And based on Assassin's Creed Origins, I remember this person who was back then a level designer. Now he's an associate world director. And he had created this massive, 80 pages PowerPoint about the quarries in Egypt. And he didn't ask me to do it for him. He showed it to me after that for validation, but he had done the research himself, and he was super proud because ultimately he had done good research. It's another subject that was quite available, I think. And then ultimately that translates well into the game. There are these queries out there. Of course, ultimately, if you're just stabbing people in the quarry instead of stabbing them by the riverside, but it felt authentic, and he had these scaffoldings. The way the rock was cut was well done because it was well researched, because there was passion coming internally from these employees.
That's really wonderful to hear, because I know for a while I had wondered myself with particularly the language. I think it's amazing, but I was like, God, that is an awful lot of work. And hearing that it was actually fueled by a particular developer's passion is so wonderful to hear, because I think sometimes these games, particularly when they're so huge and they have so many people working on them, you can kind of lose the developers a bit. So seeing that these things come out as almost kind of like the fingerprints on the game of the people that made them, I think is really lovely. I think that's really wonderful to hear. And so now I wanted to talk a little bit about Discovery Tour, because that is now, as far as I understand, your kind of bread and butter. That's the thing a lot that you focus on.
Well, it has been for many years. In a nutshell, what is Discovery Tour, for those who are not familiar with? It's an additional mode that exists to Assassin's Creed Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla. It's accessible for free for players who own these games on all platforms. And it was meant with the intention that anybody could access the game universe from Assassin's Creed, but to learn about history and game making, basically. So we removed the narrative, the conflicts, the experience from the main game, and we made it into something that could be played within 20 minutes per session or more for those who want. That could be played by families because the content is curated in that sense. That could be brought into schools, into museums, and really for anybody to be able to access these worlds of the past that we have created for Assassin's Creed. And so, yes, I've worked on that franchise I've co-created that franchise originally. And the idea with this is that back in 2014, when I ended working on Assassin's Creed Unity, and then I joined Assassin's Creed Origins, we had this tremendous feeling that we wanted to convey all of the information about the historical research that we were doing, but the game couldn't tell that. The game ultimately could not translate all of this research that we were doing and the complexity behind our decision making, and just to show how much efforts we were doing. So we felt like we could do something more than the Animus database that existed back then. And so that really was the key spark with Discovery Tour, having these museums included earlier in the process. So having them to share their artifacts, their collections, their understanding of the past, so that it would translate both in Assassin's Creed, but it would also become an opportunity to talk in a Discovery Tour about how we can bridge the gap between academia, the research, video game, and entertainment and education.
So when was it first conceived of? Was it developed alongside Origins, or, what were the kind of timelines with the development of the main game?
We really developed both simultaneously. So we had this long-term idea about wanting to make a new experience out of the Animus database and make it immersive in the world. And at the same time, we were creating Assassin's Creed Origins. So I'd say it was the flow was faster on the game than it was on the Discovery Tour. Sometimes, especially in the two first years, we were really experimenting about what would be the new concepts in terms of creativity. And so we set up on three main pillars at the beginning. Really the fact that it should be for everyone, it should be conflictless, and then it should involve collections from museums. That was really, what we had in mind. And so we started with that, with MVP, a most valuable product in our mind, and we tested that alongside when we were making Assassin's Creed Origins. And because we had this test that was available and in a game engine, we could bring those to museums. We can bring those into book publishers as well, because we were thinking long-term, how could this answer a need for education that's there? There are teachers that were asking us to create something like the Discovery Tour, but we had to understand very well who they were, how they would use it, and we had to design this. And so the first outcome with Assassin's Creed Origins, so Discovery Tour, Ancient Egypt, was really this first step. It was the best that we could do with as something that was new, that didn't exist before in video games. There were dev diary modes in some games, but nothing like a dedicated experience like the Discovery Tour. And so what it ended up with was these guided tours, curated guided tours that really feel like you're in a museum, but in the 3D world. Now I can say with some distance that the narrator choice that we made was very David Attenborough-like, very not as good. There were very great narrators, but we went a little bit more on we were trying, I think, to convince everyone about the legitimacy of this product, and it succeeded very well.
That's wonderful to hear. And I think it's interesting going back, and because I remember trying it when it first came out and going back and trying it again. And it is interesting because the first Discovery Tour, it feels very much like taking a museum like walking tour and placing it within the game. Yeah, it was really interesting. And so do you say how were the reactions from the museums, from people you brought it to?
Well, the reactions were over what we ever dreamed of. We didn't have any expectations as an amount of players. We didn't have expectations as how it would be successful, if our mission that we had set up on would work. But now I can say we have millions of, I'm not even sure about the exact numbers, but it's the first 500,000 players. We were so excited. We couldn't believe it was this successful. And when we reached first million, second million, and so on, that really showed to us that on the player side, it was a success in terms of player engagement. But then on the museum side and the public side, and then in the academic side as well, it has been a tremendous success. We've had school ever since that more and more are using it into their curriculum. And that led us to a couple of years ago to publish pedagogical guides and guides about how to use them in the classroom, because we realized that we knew it was important, but we just didn't publish it back then. And it was with the success, we realized that, we could support teachers better. There are still exhibits that are using Discovery Tour Ancient Egypt today. And I think they will be continuing to do that for quite a long time, because even though our knowledge about Egypt has evolved ever since 2018 when it was released, I think it's going to still take another 15 years before it's going to be replaced by something else, because it's such a tremendous investment for, let's say, for an archaeological society or museum, to create an immersion like this one. I think it's going to stay there, and I think the results are quite valid, because we went with information that was quite accepted, maybe except for the Great Pyramid, where we went with a theory that has been almost proven since. But
it's very clear that's one thing I really appreciated, was in that it was very clear, this is someone's theory, this is why we followed it. And I really loved the use of using named theorists, because I think sometimes it can just be, I've seen other stuff, it can be a little bit kind of wishy-washy of we think this, but actually naming the academic, putting a name to the theory, I thought was really great. I mean, it was fun. I got excited for really, I'm not going to bore everyone listening by asking you to talk about, how things were referenced and I got excited seeing the references above like the museum things and things like that. But I think I really enjoyed. So what's this idea? Because the theory part is really interesting to me because it makes it clear as, this is why as a team, as developers, we chose this. Was that aspect always going to be alongside the kind of historical education aspect, the aspect of educating people why certain choices are made within game development?
Yes. So critical thinking was a key component. We were aware that players are interested in learning how games are made. We don't want to unveil all the magic, all the details, but I believe that players are really interested in learning how it's made. And so there's one aspect there. And the other side is really the educational teaching and museum aspect. It was necessary for us to explain how it's done so that it enhances critical thinking and promotes these students into questioning what they see on screen with different mediums, because it's a work of adaptation. It's not the truth. And I'm really sorry if there are people who believe that Assassin's Creed is the truth, despite our efforts to show that it's a work of fiction. It's a great work of fiction, but it's not the truth. So it was always at the basis of Discovery Tour, and we ever since the first Discovery Tour was released, we continued in that path with the two other Discovery Tours, and we even put a lot more efforts into bringing diversity into the perspectives and the different, and explain all the different people that work on these games, where they come from, different backgrounds. They have different perspective also on how to recreate the past, and their different trades as well.
I think it's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it as a kind of pedagogical tool for approaching the series, but also video games in general, to think about how they're developed. In terms of working with the museums, I can imagine museums must be very happy, because I've worked with quite a few academics over my career, and they say, I want to turn my research into a video game. And I go, okay, let's think about this. What's your budget? And then they tell me their budget, and I go, yeah, it's going to be, unless you're going to make a Twine game or something, it's going to be hard. And so I imagine museums are pretty happy when you turn up and you have this incredibly rendered, gorgeous 3D environment. But in terms of kind of where you're pitching it, because you're kind of pitching it to a lot of different people, an educational tool, museum, player, in terms of age range and writing to someone, how do you pitch it when it's covering so many different people?
7 to 77. That's the way we pitch it.
And 78, you're out. You're not going to get
exactly. 78. That's it. That's over. No, I'm kidding. So it's for everyone. But the way Discovery Tour is built is that we have to go with what is accessible for all, and I mean accessibility in the sense of technology, but also content. I'd say Discovery Tour Ancient Egypt was probably the one that asks for people to know the most before actually playing the experience. And we adapted that with the two other ones based on feedback and continuing discussions with educators. But the idea is that we want this to be a first point of contact with history. And then people, if they're interested, they go into the museum, they go and buy books, and then they'll learn more. If someone plays Discovery Tour and they play the whole Discovery Tour, in the end, they probably, if they remember everything, they probably, are able to pass their undergrad in Egyptology or a graduate student in Egyptology. Maybe they won't understand everything about the technique of researching the past, but they'll know a lot of things. The idea with having a range that's so broad, with having like from 7 to anyone basically, is that it's not difficult in terms of access with the controller or with the keyboard. It's not difficult to orient oneself in the game universe. We really want to make sure that it's easy so that anybody can learn from this. But of course, as you say, it's a trade-off, because if only players of Assassin's Creed were meant to play Discovery Tour, then of course maybe their expectation would have been different. But at the same time, Discovery Tour is not Assassin's Creed. It hasn't been made to be quests for adults that are mature. The narrative, we're not asking for players to play for between 60 hours or 200 hours to play Discovery Tour. It's much smaller in times also, and it's a different pace. And I think that was refreshing for a lot of players. When they just want to take a break from their main game, they can go and play Discovery Tour, and then they can learn something because they're interested in knowing more about the history behind. They're curious. Maybe before that, in previous games, they would have open up a browser on their phone or on their computer and get curious and see the result. And I think people still do that. Players still do that, even with Discovery Tour. And I encourage them to do that. But they didn't have to get out of the player experience to get access to that information. They just needed to change the menu, and then boom, they were in this new universe where they could choose quickly which tour they could take based on the openness of these tours. They were not gated. You could just access all of them from the get-go.
So you mentioned accessibility before, and I think this is something that comes up a lot in terms of using games of education, because I know games are treated as kind of like a magic tool. Like people will be like, well, it's a game, therefore, it's going to do X, Y, and Z, or the other way around, where people don't see the value at all. It can be quite divisive in that way. And also because not just accessibility in terms of, okay, well, how do I use this controller, but also the kind of expense of having access to hardware, to software, things like that. How much of that did that play when you were developing Discovery Tour?
A lot. And this is also why we decided to go with something that was easy. For the two first Discovery Tours, I'd say the last one over the Viking Ages is another subject. We chose a different trope based on more experience and feedback that we had. But in education, there are so many different ways to go about this, because the Discovery Tours are published worldwide. Every region, every age group, every person is different. And so we decided to come up with a design that would be very generous for that reason, obviously. So we were aware that it would not fit every need perfectly, but we were aware that, for instance, high school teachers they would bring one console into the classroom and they would be the one playing, not the students. In another context, it could be all like 4 students for every computer, then they would play Discovery Tour. Like maybe one of them would play, or all of them would play in turn. We were aware that these were all different situations that we could not monitor, but that would exist, and we were trying to design around these difficulties. And that's why it was so important before, during, and after to collaborate with educators, to collaborate with professors as well in education, and to test all the time. I mean, we do that already with video games in general. A game like Assassin's Creed, before it's released, has been tested over and over at various times during its production. But we did the same for learning and for the player experience with Discovery Tour, because we wanted to make sure that what we ended up with was a good product, and not just a flashy product out there, but that nobody would use. So it was really important. We only had this one chance to create something that was unique, and I think we were really all in on this effort.
No, it's fantastic. And as someone who uses video games in teaching, thank you for testing it in the classroom before bringing it out, because that is always my pet peeve. And you can tell with Discovery Tour that that's all being thought about, rather than it feels very much ingrained in the tour itself. And I just wanted to ask a bit about, so you say you have kind of curators and people writing the tours themselves. Were those historians or experts who were already embedded in the game, or were they invited on for Discovery Tour?
Discovery Tour usually relies on the same consultants, Egyptologists in the case of Assassin's Creed Origins, that were working for the main game. But usually we ask for even more people for Discovery Tour to help us with the tours. And there are two good reasons for that. Is the question of flow. It's a lot of content with Discovery Tours, so we wanted to divide the task between a lot different people. And we also we had the opportunity to choose more specific researchers from various regions in the world to show this diversity and to create these contact points that would be in these different regions with these different institutions or museums, really to have a better diversity of understanding and better knowledge that we could bring into the game. So, I mean, it's quite common, for instance, for academics, to go through different universities in their career to actually have these different inputs. It was the same for Discovery Tour. And so I can say with every Discovery Tour, we usually have much more consultants than we have on the main game, because we have to work very quickly. And we already have the results from the research that was done on the main game, but now we have to make it into wording, into sentences that we really have to be serious about to make sure that we hit it right.
So what do you see, what do you hope for Discovery Tour going forward? What would be your do you have a particular goal that you're imagining, or, what do you see for the future?
Well, we have these 3 Discovery Tours that are out there. Now we have curriculum guides to help teachers. I really hope that they continue to live a good life. I see, sometimes I look at the numbers online, the numbers that we have internally, and I'm happy to see that they progress. They still progress. People are still contacting us about these tours. So I really wish that they continue on that path. And I couldn't be prouder about that.
That's wonderful. And So just asking about, what was learned through the making of Origins. So, what did you learn? It can either be on like a personal level or kind of through development, or, it can be something about Egypt you found interesting, or yeah.
Well, with Origins, for me, I wasn't an Egyptologist before, so with every new game, the challenge for historians on these projects and every employee is to learn something new totally, and to see how we can adapt our medium to this new content that we're finding. See, there's one thing that's not specific to Origins, but to all different games that I work on is to see how we share a common humanity, and how ultimately we have so much in common, even if we come from different countries. This is, I think, is the most important thing that I take away from doing research, from looking at, you're looking at a tomb from Egypt from 4,000 years ago, and this family has, they've made all the process to mummify their beloved one and to create this mortuary rite, because it was important for them, because family, for instance, has been a super important component, and that's fundamentally something that we share in common as humans. So I'd say that's really something that I find touching about doing research, whether it's in ancient Egypt or in different countries.
What a wonderfully, beautifully poetic answer to my slightly stumbling question. Thank you so much, Maxime. I mean, I could go off on a tangent and ask you about the kind of histories of emotions and things like that, but I think now we have to move on to our quickfire questions. Now, I'm aware this game came out a little while ago. You may not have an answer for all of them. I just realized something. I did want to ask this. Why does Cleopatra have a British accent? Was this kind of a nod to the Hollywoods? Or I just found it interesting of all the effort that went into the language. Cleopatra comes up and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot she's British.
So no, there was no tie with previous Hollywood movies. There's a point where you're building a core team around the main actors, and then you're making a decision on what's going to be the accent. And there's this tipping point where you have to stick to the accent of the main actors that you're choosing for, especially for main characters. And so I think that was built around Abubakar Salim, who was playing Bayek, and who's British, and who did tremendous work. And so once that was done, ultimately it made sense that they would stick to that. So I think most of the main characters are either British or emulating a British accent.
Okay. I just sorry, that was almost purely just out of me being curious.
But it's a good question, because there's always this opportunity to decide which is gonna be the accent, what it conveys. Does it convey a feeling of authenticity? There's a message always, and even though the game is released in English, it could be mid-Atlantic, which is this fictive language that can be chosen to be more neutral. It's really a discussion that has to unfold on every game. But once the project sticks to it, usually to kind of get the actors to play these roles and go along with that. But then there are the exotic words. How do we pronounce them? How much do we want to have a feeling of the language? Let's say if we were in Egypt today, would Egyptians speak with the same kind of accent in English that Abubakar Salim played with for Bayek? So these are kind of questions that we ask ourselves, and we try to play with and make sure that all the actors stick to this as well.
I mean, it was interesting because I remember, when I heard Cleopatra's voice, it did make me stop and reflect, and I was like, oh, well, I guess the Ptolemaic kind of dynasty were more Greek than they were Egyptian. So maybe is it an idea of a sense of kind of almost like othering of this person, and that she is both of this world and very different. So it opened up a lot of doors, whether intentional or not. So
well, if you want, we can go on a lot, especially with Cleopatra. But I also want to be mindful of the time of the listeners, and thank you for that.
Yeah, you hopefully you won't see that this podcast is actually 3 hours long and just me, talking about Cleopatra. I'll save that for another time. So yes, sorry, back to quickfire questions. If this is a thing that you can do you have a favorite character in the game?
Ptolemy.
Oh, okay.
Because
you do have a favorite character. That was quick.
Yes, but it's so ridiculous in a way. I thought it was very fun the way that they play with him. His story, of course, is quite tragic when we look at it from a factual sense. But I think it was well done for players, and it gave an opportunity for Cleopatra to really shine and show the presence that she had, especially next to her and Julius Caesar and Pompey. I mean, he's quite a side character, but I thought it was really nice.
Do you have a favorite viewpoint or location in the game?
It would be Memphis, really, because it's a city that we rebuilt from the ground up, especially with the help of Jean-Claude Godvin and with archaeologists. I think it was so nice to see that this ancient city could be made alive with the temples, with the Temple of Ptah. I think it was really well done and interesting. So yeah, super proud, and every time I see it, I have goosebump.
It is particularly beautiful. I mean, I just got a lot of joy out of wandering through the kind of, I guess, more like common areas of like with the more kind of, the kind of mud bricks and stuff. I just thought, oh, wow, this is, really stunning.
It conveys so much in the fact that it shows that it's the only place I think where we can really well see the fact that the Nile, was going up and down every year, which it doesn't anymore because of dams that have been built in the last century. But that was something that was so important, and it's a key component of the Egyptian thinking that it's a matter of fate, it's a matter of religion, how the water would come in and bring life to the bank of the Nile. So that's why I'm saying this in a way that it's simple when I look at Memphis, but behind for what it represents in my mind is tremendous. So that's why it's so important for me.
Do you have a favorite detail? It can be really, really tiny or anything at all.
The tomb of Alexander in Alexandria, and the reason for that is that we had a lot of freedom to create content there. And so when we go into the tomb, there are elements that I like and some others that I don't like as much, but there was this creative choice that we had, which was to create this dynasty story about the Ptolemies. And this is how we built the tomb, really. We built upon the fact that Ptolemy stole, allegedly, Alexander's body, brought it back, and he's the only one of his successors who really, his dynasty stood in the long term, but he wasn't meant to be king of or pharaoh. Alexander's son was supposed to be the legitimate ruler, and so Ptolemy brought Alexander back allegedly and created this tomb. And what we did with the story around the tomb, if players take the time to look carefully, it really tells maybe this tale that we were envisioning that Ptolemy would have created to legitimize his reign. And legitimize Alexander's reign for Egypt. So I think it's a lot of playful elements for a historian, and with the artist, we really had a lot of fun to create that.
That's an excellent answer. And I think, kind of showing the kind of political motives behind the building of these places, I think is incredibly clear. And why not have fun with that and really lean into it? Okay, now, do you think there's something that players might miss when they're playing the game that you think you should draw attention to, or you would like them to take notice of?
It's a good one. I actually don't know. I know there's it's a very, very good one, and there's nothing that comes to my mind just about this. I think there's so many details, and fun fact is the size of monuments is usually quite right for the lighthouse, the pyramids, the Sphinx, but temples are usually about three times the size higher than reality, because the game uses this third perspective camera with the lens, and it usually what it does is it puts landmarks smaller than they really are if we have them on the right scale. And because usually we have these dunes around, temples would have felt smaller and not as grandiose. And so that's why we played a lot with that.
That's really interesting. And also, I guess the kind of architects of these temples weren't expecting people to be climbing up the columns and, jumping on the ceiling, and may not have had that in mind.
Yeah, I don't think they did that.
Well, thank you so much, Maxime, for talking to me and joining us. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to reminisce on these memories, and I think Assassin's Creed Origins is still one of the most interesting experience that I've had at Ubisoft so far. And I think, it's going to have a long-lasting legacy.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. You should also hit the links that are floating on the screen somewhere. Are they on my face? They're on my face again, aren't they? Get them off. Follow a link, please.